The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. My name is Laura Kaminsky. As Associate Director of Education for the Humanities, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Y for the second evening of our new series, Artists' Visions, the State of Contemporary Art. Two brief announcements. First, the 92nd Street Y is pleased to have received a $500,000 challenge grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to develop and support programs such as this evening's. The envelope which you received upon entering the hall can be used to send us your tax-deductible contribution. Your generosity will be deeply appreciated. Second, please note that Mr. Caro, our next lecturer in this series, will not be speaking at the Y, but will lecture at the Dalton School Auditorium located nearby at 108 East 89th Street between Park and Lexington Avenues. This lecture takes place next Tuesday evening, March 26th at 8:15 p.m. Tickets are still available at the box office. Now, on to the evening before us. We are indeed honored in this series to present three influential and distinguished individuals, each of whom has made a prodigious mark on the 20th century art world. Last week, Clement Greenberg delivered an eloquent lecture on current philosophical and aesthetic directions in contemporary art specifically and in our culture generally. Tonight, we are honored to present Robert Motherwell. Next week, as you know, we will conclude the series with sculptor Anthony Caro. The format tonight is as follows. Mr. Motherwell will present his lecture and slide demonstration. You will then be able to submit written questions on the index cards which you received as you entered the hall. Please print your questions clearly. Ushers will collect the cards in about 45 minutes and bring them backstage for presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce the newly appointed Executive Director of the 92nd Street Y, Dr. Robert Fisher, who will introduce tonight's distinguished speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Robert Fisher.
Thank you very much, Laura, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are always delighted to welcome the guests of the 92nd Street Y. We do so many hundreds of times every year when, through our lecture hall, on the stage of our theater, and in this historic concert hall, we have the privilege of presenting to the most discriminating audiences in America, world leaders in the performing arts, in contemporary thought, in letters, and, as in the case of this evening, the fine arts. It is a personal thrill to introduce a distinguished gentleman whose art has always represented for me personally one of the most remarkable statements of modern American vitality. Robert Motherwell was the youngest of the major artists who during the 1940s and 1950s transformed the history of American painting. At the center of the movement which came to be known as abstract-expressionism, his career over 4 decades has earned him a unique place in the history of art. Please join the 92nd Street Y in welcoming Robert Motherwell.
Good evening, and thank you for coming. I got so many notes, I'm dizzy. Lately, I've been interviewed a lot and encountered a lot of people who ask me various questions. Can you hear me back there? Oh, good. And the questions seem to be such as how the creative process works and what really happens in a studio. What were the 1940s like when we began to make the breakthroughs? What do you think about the contemporary scene? And to that question, it pounds more and more in my mind how real history is. Though they both, now is 1985 in New York, and the 1940s were in New York, it's a different New York in some indescribable ways. And then a question that comes out in my biographies, they always give my education, which I think in the case of most artists is irrelevant. You become an artist the instant you stop having an education. But I majored in philosophy at Stanford University and went on to the graduate school at Harvard University in philosophy. And then after a year in Paris, where I was supposed to be working on a thesis, but really painted, I came and spent a year in a graduate school at Columbia with Mara Shapiro. And then at the end of that year, I said to hell with it and started painting for good, which I have ever since. And what people don't understand in reading all of this, because there's nothing to give them the clue, is it's the other way around. I was a painter. I won my first fellowship when I was 12 at the greatest art school in California where I grew up. And but I'm a Depression child. I became 21 in 1936. And my father took a dim view, as one might, of anybody in those days becoming a painter, and made a sort of deal with me, very humane and reasonable on his part, that if I would get a doctorate as an insurance policy against the 1 in a million chance that I was any good as a painter, that then he would very modestly support me during my years of trying to be a painter. So in floating around universities, I discovered ultimately that the philosophy departments were small, intimate. Under the rubric of philosophy, you can study practically anything. The students were highly intelligent. The professors were intelligent, and there was a certain purity to it, but the only possible future for a philosopher is to be a professor of philosophy. There's no external thing. And so that's how I became a philosopher and enjoyed it and learned a lot, but also left it and so on. And then the other thing is, why aren't I more of an American painter? And I mean, there's something that I'm a Francophile or Hispanophile or in some way not really rooted in America, though one side of my family came on one of the first boats after the Mayflower, and I don't know how anybody could be more American than I am, basically. But I'm not going to answer those questions directly. I think in what I am going to say, a lot of them will answer themselves. And I'm going to talk about basically 4 different things. The nature of abstraction, very briefly, is even though abstract art has been fairly dominant in our century, there's still a lot of people who really don't understand what the damn word means. And then I'm going to talk about what happens in the studio as best I can. And then I'll show you a few slides that were taken in my studio last Friday, so you can see what's actually going on at this moment. Then I want to talk about briefly about the paintings, the series of paintings that I'm probably best known for, the Elegies to the Spanish Republic series. And then if I have time, I have a horror of boring anybody, I'll talk a bit about the 40s in relation to the 80s. The word abstract comes from the Latin ab and the verb strare, which means to take away from, to separate from, to select from, in the interests of imaginability. For example, if somebody wanted to paint a battle for the Civil War and wanted to make it as realistic as possible, they would have to use a very low degree of abstraction. And presumably, the more complete the picture became as a document of, let's say, Gettysburg, the more there would be every leaf, every cannonball, every bloody soldier, the sky, and so on. And nowadays with cinema, there would be sound and, if possible, smell, and so on. So that you can say to do that kind of completeness is the opposite of abstraction, or the lowest form of abstraction, which is to say there are degrees of abstraction, and there's actually no work of art that is not abstract to some degree. And the artist, consciously or unconsciously, tends to choose the level of abstraction that he wishes, to select what he wants and to leave the rest out. From that standpoint, you might say that Picasso, without any philosophical training, is one of the greatest epistemologists who ever lived. He knew exactly, he was capable of any degree of realism or abstraction, and deliberately chose precisely the degree of abstraction that he wanted in any given case. Now, also popularly, there's the word abstraction tends to have a connotation, I think, especially in relation to the physical sciences and to mathematics and so on, of being cold or being not very tangible, very palpable. But that's not at all necessarily the case. It depends on what the subject matter is, what is being selected from, and so on. You might say that Matisse, for example, who's relatively abstract, is nevertheless a very warm abstractionist, just as there are others who are cool, not because they're involved in abstraction, but because they essentially have colder minds. And there's a marvelous remark from Whitehead, who put me on more than anybody else to this whole notion of direct aphorism. The higher the degree of abstraction, the lower the degree of complexity. So that Matisse then would be a lower degree of abstraction and a greater degree of complexity than most of Picasso. Picasso would be a lower degree of abstraction and a greater degree of complexity than Mondrian. And Mondrian would be a lower degree of abstraction than, say, Carl André's bricks. But it is absurd to say that André is the greatest of these four, as it is to say that Andrew Wyeth, with the lowest degree of abstraction, and therefore the greatest complication, is. And of course, the function of abstraction is emphasis. It's to underline what you want and to, so to speak, get rid of what Duchamp called excess baggage. It's also true, the higher the degree of abstraction, the less thick, the less dense, in certain ways, the quality of the experience. And I think there are absolute analogies for what I've just said in modern music, poetry, and so on. Now, I don't know, 6 years ago or something, I had a museum exhibition at a university, and after the opening, which was mid-afternoon, and they asked me to meet the audience and so on. And I happened to be standing next to a huge black and white picture of mine, which is now hanging in the Museum of Modern Art. The show happened to be about my black paintings. And a middle-aged bourgeois man came up to me and said, "Exactly what does that mean? Or how do you go about doing it? Or what's the idea behind it?" Because we happened to be standing in front of the painting, which is better than an after image inside my head. I looked at it. I realized that the picture had been painted over several times and radically changed in shape, in balance, in all kinds of things, in weights. At one time it was too black. At one time the rhythm of it was too regular. At one time there wasn't enough variation in the secret geometry of the shapes. Immediately I realized that each brushstroke is a decision, and that is a decision made not aesthetically, that is, will this look more beautiful, is a decision that has to do with one's gut. It is getting too heavy or too light. It has to do with one's sense of sensuality. The surface is getting too coarse or not fine enough. It has to do with one's sense of life. Is it airy and lively, or is it leaden? It has to do with one's own inner sense of weights. I happen to be a heavy, clumsy, awkward man, and if something gets too airy, perhaps even though I admire it very much, it doesn't feel like myself, my I, to me. But in the end, I realized that whatever meaning a picture has is the accumulated meaning of hundreds of brushstrokes, each one being decided as it's painted. In that sense, to say what does a painting mean is unanswerable, except as the accumulation of hundreds of these decisions with a brush, which, if the painting takes 2 months to paint, one's basic character has to be involved. I mean, on a single day or in a few hours or less, one might be in an unusually peculiar state and make something much lighter, much heavier, much smaller, much bigger than one normally would. But if you steadily work at something over a period of time, your whole being comes out in the same way that, what shall I say, if I were teaching students, I would like to teach them for 2 years and not just some weeks. That is, if I liked them. Now, the next thing is I've modified some from a lecture I gave more than 20 years ago to thousands, it seemed, in some big hotel in New York. There was a meeting of something like the American Association of Psychotherapists, and I happen to know socially lots of psychoanalysts. They like to play poker, they like to collect pictures. One of the few things they seem to believe in is creativity. And there was something that they never quite got, that, or generally didn't, that used to exasperate me a bit. But I think this is maybe the clearest statement I've made in all the writings I've done, because I realized that these people, most people in our society are very verbal, And when they're not verbal, they have a very acute sense of hearing. I mean, almost every young woman can sing a popular song as soon as she hears it. And relatively speaking, people are not visual. If I enter a first-rate writer's room, sometimes I'm stunned at the total lack of visual sensibility. But anyway, in realizing that this is the fact, I sort of went out of my way to put as simply and as clearly as I could what I think is one of the major defects in a lot of psychiatric, psychoanalytic, and psychological writing about the creative process, for better or worse. The failure of much psychological writing about artistic activity and the unconscious is out of an inability to comprehend, in a verbally oriented culture, the depth and the intimacy of the marriage between the artist and his medium. A painting is not a picture of something in front of your eyes, a model, say, primarily. It is an attack on the medium, which then comes to mean something. My impression is that a great deal is known about the unconscious, even though there is a lot more to be known, but that very little is known about creativity. I would venture an intuition that this ignorance, in part, is owing to vastly underrating the role of the medium. Most laymen think of a painting as a representation of something in front of you as you work, or of something that you recall or imagine. That is, painting is thought of as a one-to-one correlation with a specific experience. But is not this at all. It is not a one-to-one relation. It is a triadic relation, composed of the artist, the subject, the medium. The medium has a long history of its own and important contemporary problems that every competent artist knows by heart. The subject does not pre-exist. It emerges out of the interaction between the artist and the medium. That is why, and only how, a modern picture can be creative, and why its conclusions cannot be predetermined. When you have a predetermined conclusion, you have academic art by definition. My suspicion, but here I venture out of the realm of my own particular competence, my suspicion is that an artist begins as a person with an enormous capacity for love, who cannot, in the beginning anyway, direct his love toward another person satisfactorily, and consequently directs it toward a medium instead. You must understand that as far as I can see, an artistic medium is the only thing in human existence that has precisely the same range of sensed feeling as people themselves do. And it's only when you think of the medium as having the same potential as another human being that you begin to see the nature of the artist's involvement as it appears to himself. Now, if a creative person in the arts is a person with an extraordinary capacity for love, who, for whatever reason, say because of his early experience with his mother, cannot direct his love toward another person in full strength, but who nevertheless must love, he therefore directs his love toward the other thing in human existence as rich, sensitive, supple, and complicated as human beings themselves. That is to say, toward an artistic medium, which is not an inert object, or conversely a set of rules for composition, but a living collaboration, which not only reflects every nuance of one's being, but which, in the moments in which one is lost, often comes to one's aid, not arbitrarily and capriciously, like the Greek goddesses intervening in man's fate, but seriously, accurately, concretely with you, as when a canvas says to you, this empty space in me needs to be pinker, or a shape says, I want to be larger and more expansive, or the format says, the conception is too large or too small for me, all out of scale. Or a stripe says, gouge me more, you're too polite and elegant. Or a gray says, a bit more blue, my present hue is uncomfortable and does not fit with what surrounds me. Now, if the mutual empathy between the artist and the medium has been sufficiently emphasized, then I can quite briefly indicate some of the puzzling transactions that take place in a studio. First of all, you have to get used to the room. In a new studio, this takes, say, from 4 to 30 weeks. In an old one that you haven't used for a month or two, a few days. Days of hell. Consequently, one hesitates to travel. It is difficult to find a big room traveling. You can find any other kind of habitation, but not a big empty room. And it takes too long to get used to it, if one does. And there's the hellish beginning again awaiting one at home. It is, of course, not a question of any room, as it is for a writer. When I write, I can write anywhere. But in a studio, everything that you make is related to the room in which you are working, to the scale of it, to the light of it, to the color of the walls, to the character of the floor, the view within, the view without, which is to say, it is a spatial and a visual world, as are the things you yourself are working on. And consequently, one has to become enormously familiar with the room, used to it, what its defects are, what its virtues are, and so on. On Cape, excuse me, on Cape Cod, where I spend the summers, and sometimes play poker with the psychoanalysts I mentioned, along with artists. The analysts are always kidding us artists that we're so involved with real estate as though somehow we're born capitalists. But it has nothing to do with the desire for possession. In fact, I think all artists, as other people do, detest the responsibility of so many toilets, windows, roofs, and so on that you get involved in. But I cannot work in somebody else's place or in a place that I'm unfamiliar with any more than I can live with a stranger. And after not working for a while, or a month or two, as for example, when you change from a summer studio to a winter studio, or have gone away for a while, or somebody has been ill, one gets cold creatively, so to speak. Well, then one goes into the studio naked and comes out bruised. Given the privacy of the medium, what help is there in one's memories of sex, of geography, of nature, of people, of politics, or in one's present experiences of them, for that matter? No, the issue is between you and the medium, that empty, blank, white rectangle that so paralyzed Mallarmé in paper, and of which Kandinsky rightly said, it is more beautiful empty than most finished pictures. And even the medium itself is not that simple. The medium does not exist ahistorically, subspecie aeternitas. Renaissance painters, for example, used a brick-colored canvas. Their whole sense of what a picture is different from ours. That is to say, painting now, like everything else, is contemporary and historical, not denying the past, but in essence a silent collaboration among scores of studios between New York and Rome and Madrid and Tokyo, constantly conditioning our contemporary sense of the medium. I began 45 years ago with a Parisian surrealist in exile in New York, though I myself have never been a surrealist painter because I rejected their sense, for the main part, of what a picture is. But the surrealists had a theory of creativity which they called psychic automatism, what psychoanalysts would call free association, what in its most common visual form in everyday life would be called doodling, or what some people nowadays call artful scribbling. One might say that Paul Klee was the supreme doodler, unless it was Miro. Pollock used a bullwhip. I usually begin a picture with a doodle. And it's unfortunate the word doodle is so demeaning or offhand. But if any of you work in an office where there's somebody or several people who doodle at the telephone, you'll discover that very quickly you can tell who was there using the phone before you. And it's a marvelous device, as free association is in psychoanalysis, to break through received conditioning and social mannerisms and all that junk you learn in art schools and get to what is specifically yourself, which in the end is what any art is. I usually begin a picture with a doodle or with a liquid puddle, like half a Rorschach image that is not pressed together so it's double, which gives me the horrors. Or with a line and a dot, or a piece of paper dropped at random on what will become a collage. Then the struggle begins and endures throughout in a state of anxiety that is ineffable, but obliquely recorded in the inner tensions of the finished canvas. The struggle has inexorable moral values for each artist. In some cases of modern artists, no nostalgia, no sentimentalism, no propaganda, no discourse, nothing discursive or descriptive, no violation of the canvas as a surface, since it is one, no cliches, no predetermined endings, no seduction, no relaxation, limpness, no mere taste, no obviousness, no coldness. Or oppositely, for me, it must have a certain immediacy, passion or tenderness, beingness as such, a certain psychic distance, and sheer presence as a modulation of the flat picture plane. True invention and search, light, an unexpected end, mainly warm earth colors and black and white, a certain sturdiness. I usually paint to begin with on the floor. The shape of the liquid puddles is more controllable. Moreover, the sense of the pictorial surface as a whole is better sustained under your feet and not fractured by three-dimensional space. That is to say, when a picture's on the floor, you can walk around it and get rid of the problem of the horizon. Whenever you're looking at anything vertically, there's a tendency unconsciously to introduce a horizon which you can turn into a stripe or deliberately in some way get rid of, but it's really much more practical to just walk around it on the floor, because looking at something on the floor, you never think of it as having a horizon. I often paint in series, a dozen or more versions of the same thing at once, of the same theme, that is, at once. One brings the weakest one up to the strongest one, which in turn becomes the weakest, which then has to be made stronger, and so on ad infinitum, so that hopefully one goes beyond oneself, or sometimes below. Sometimes one goes too far and loses it all. There is no knowing, only faith. The alternative faith is really a black void. Sometimes that beautiful white virgin canvas that I begin with, after countless transformations, ends up nearly wholly black. What is devastating about art to its maker is its truthfulness. You think you love white and find your soul black, that you love airiness and you are as heavy as clay or whatever. Art, like reality, brings you to your knees. But I would not trade with anyone. As Mondrian used to say, if we cannot free ourselves from the hazards and conflicts inherent in living in space and time, we can free our vision. The artist's medium is collaborator, his friend, and often his enemy, his conscience made visible in that effort that Mondrian speaks of, in which only a few will succeed. Now, I very quickly want to show you just a few slides. Do you hear me up there? Slides, please. Oh, sorry. Oh, no, it's hard for me. As I say, these were. I don't know. Oh, I'm sorry. As I say, these first slides were taken Friday. This is one of the most recent pictures, which was going to be developed much more, and I just decided that what it particularly has to say is already said, and there's no use overcooking it. Next. There's a huge elegy that you're just seeing an angle of. Next. There's more of it. No. Yes. This is Elegy to the Spanish Republic, number 132, though there aren't nearly that many. I used to forget the numbers, and but at any rate, this was shown in the Guggenheim Museum during the retrospective last month or the month before, whenever it was, and the center panel was quite different there, though this picture was painted in 75. But looking at it at the Guggenheim, surrounded by other works, I realized there was something wrong with it. And as soon as it was delivered back to me, I took that center panel and repainted it. I was going to do some more, but now it seems just right to me. But I may change my mind again someday. Next. 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 The big one on the right is a relatively recent, I think, last year, last winter, and somehow the Elegy image is squashed more than it ever was. So this one on the left I'm working on at the moment, trying to figure out why that particular structure is beginning to change form, change its character without my willing for it to do so, but also trusting that it's as intelligent as I am. But the only way I can find out is to investigate more and find one way or the other. Next. And these are collages in progress. In fact, that second one from the left I changed this morning. Go on. Next. Next. And you see, it's what I was saying earlier, by comparing them as they progress, I can tell much better than if I'm looking at one alone, because one's memory deceives one as to how good a picture is. Next. And this is my winter studio in Connecticut, just past the New York line. Next. And this is a view from the opposite direction. Now, next I'm going to show the summer studio. And you'll see the colors here are all different. I mean, they're greens and browns and grays, and it's much more somber than the summer. And the way nature affects me, and I think almost the only way, is that my palette changes, not on purpose, because I never paint from nature, but I, so to speak, get saturated with the colors that I'm looking at every day. And when the moment comes in a certain area of the canvas to pick up a color, I begin to change to colors that are somehow become absorbed. Next. And this is my summer studio in Cape Cod. Next. Next. But in the summer, as is obvious from looking at this, a lot of blue and white begin to creep into my palette, even though I'm using relatively the same kind of imagery. Next. This is the first mature painting I made in 1941, which is the year I started painting seriously, called The Little Spanish Prison, and was painted in Mexico, which is where I began to paint first. Next. Here's a painting, as a homage to Posada, who affected me very much in Mexico, the great Mexican folk artist. Next. And this is the Reconciliation Elegy mural in the National Gallery in Washington, and I called it that because Franco was dead. It had elections, had a parliament and president, and an extremely liberal king who believes in a constitutional monarchy, like in England, where he was partly educated, which is one of Franco's great mistakes. Next. And the picture on the right is called The Spanish Death, and was painted right after I heard about Franco's death in 1975. Next. 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 This is an earlier version of that elegy that I just repainted. Next. 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 And this is the picture, the black and white picture that I was referring to earlier in the talk, of the accumulation of brushstrokes, which don't show very clearly here, but it's a huge canvas, I think 17 or 18 feet, and every inch of it has brushstrokes on it. Next. Oh, I guess that's it. Now, I go on to the third part. An English critic was interviewing me about the Spanish elegies, and I talked about beginning to paint in Mexico, and he copied this down, and it was published somewhere in Europe, and I came across it the other day, and I said, in death, the continual presence of sudden death in Mexico, I have never seen a race of people so heedless of life. The presence everywhere of death iconography, coffins, black glass enclosed horse-drawn hearses, sugar skulls, figures of death in papier-mâché, priests' skeletons in glass cases, lurid popular woodcuts, Posada. He is startling the way Verdi is. The people really find their voice in a man like that. And many other things. Women in black, cypress trees in the cemeteries, burning candles, black-edged death notices and death announcements, calling cards, as you say. All of this contrasted with bright sunlight, white-garbed peasants. I'm talking about 45 years ago. Blue skies, orange trees, and everything you associate with life. All of this seized my imagination. For years afterward, spattered blood appeared in my pictures, red paint. And then another scholar wrote this sentence. The sources for the elegies then are numerous and multiple. The artist's California childhood, his travels and connections with Mexico. My first wife was a half Spanish, half Indian Mexican. His political experience of the Spanish Civil War, his reading of Lorca and his knowledge of Miro and Picasso, yet none of these are described in the elegies. Rather, they correlate to the general feeling of the format and a suggested confrontation of life and death in Hispanic terms. Instead of the subject being a combination of various sources, it is as if the elegies themselves created their subject. Or as the artist says, I recognized in them black as one of my subjects. And then somebody else, or maybe I myself, wrote this. Certain California childhood impressions, and again I'm talking about California before the Second World War, before there was a migration that basically destroyed a more homogeneous, peaceful, with a slightly Hispanic overtone, the way New England has a slightly Anglo-Saxon overtone in the architecture and so on. Yes, certain California childhood impressions last a lifetime. What a burden. Sunlit, arid, high blue skies, green on blue ocean, sun-baked yellow ochre inland, both dry, except for foggy San Francisco, and sensual. Painting problem, dryness and sensuality both. Sharp edges, soot-black shadows. Death is desiccation there, not wet rot like garbage. Ancient oaks, no underbrush, everything clear as in early Italian painting. Oh, those sharp edges, not like the north. The warm feeling of the sun on my skin. In a southern clime, one would usually not be an atmospheric painter. In bright sunlight, everything, even in the distance, is clear, with sharp shadows and sharp edges, as with the hill towns of Italy or midday Spain. I must say, one of the troubles I have in New York when I use, what I say, a Mediterranean, a southern palette, is in a certain dreariness in New York City's lack of light and grayness and maybe even a certain cynicism at times. If you use bright colors, it's somehow taken as though you're being superficial or joyful, instead of it being as natural as, say, skyscrapers being painted in gray with a gray sky here. in the middle of the winter, which is, say, what is natural to one eye in relation to its environment is read by another eye with a different life experience in an entirely different way, just as various peoples read each other differently. Now, where am I? And as I say, the question has come up from time to time, why should I be dealing with a foreign subject matter, so to speak? And people often miss the obvious. The Spanish Civil War started in 1936. I was 21 in 1936 and beginning to develop a political consciousness a bit, which was also the depth of the Depression. And there was an intimation among educated people in France, in England, and in America, a premonition that this was the beginning of our generation's story and probably the prelude to a Second World War. If the time ever comes, God forbid, let's say there's war in the Mideast or wherever, and the major powers slowly begin to take sides and help one side or the other, you'll begin to experience again that sense of foreboding, plus the fact that it seemed much more, the issues seemed much more black and white, that to democracies of the West, it was an issue with dictatorship, and moreover, in our naivete, with our innocent belief in progress and all of that, a kind of stunning realization that it was possible to turn the clock back, that it was possible to not permit the Spanish Republic, which had been elected a few years before, to ever grow out of babyhood and in fact keep Spain back in its not allow it to enter the 20th century and the savagery, because there's no reconciliation on that kind of a fundamental issue on both sides, was horrifying, though of course, and maybe in a way more apprehensible than when the Second World War started. It was on such a scale and was such unseen before horrors that it became just as the atomic bomb possibility now is so staggering that it is in a way almost impossible to express it. Where the Spanish Civil War was life-size still, and then the World War became beyond life in every sense of the word, and so on. So that in devoting myself for many years to this theme, which I didn't do on purpose, I stumbled on the imagery in my usual procedures, but realized that there was something very different about it, which at first struck me aesthetically more, that hitherto my pictures had been mainly personal and intimate, and that there was something monumental and therefore public about this imagery, and I happen to be a very retiring person, not an activist. And so my medium surprised me by, so to speak, making a public statement. And then I began to think, in terms of my experience, if this is a public statement, then what do I want to attach it to? And it very quickly became clear to me that the deepest public feelings I had at that time were about the issue of authoritarianism and its victims. And so I started it that way and went on for many years. And in one of the few intelligent reviews I've ever had in my life, in a magazine called The Nation, by a man whom I've never met, a professional philosopher at Columbia, in talking about the work, he believes that I was able to sustain it all those years because it is a deep emotion in me. There are other pictures that from time to time I've come back to, as I tend to work on something, a theme for a while and then drop it for another, and have maybe 6 or 7 basic themes, and drop them sometimes for 2 or 3 years, and then come back to them, and they obviously correspond to different aspects of my character. My feelings in collaging are quite different from my feelings in painting and so on. And I think he's right. And the reasons I'm giving you are partly rational, partly the circumstances that this was my historical period, which began at a very impressionable age, that the visuality of California and Mexico and Spain are very similar. The light, the dry earth, all the rest of it, the dark shadows, so that in a way my natural painting temperament was also equipped to use a certain kind of Spanish materiality. Actually, there are 2 kinds of Spanish painting: the plastic Goya Picasso kind, and the opposite, the Dali pyrotechnical, glossy, slick kind. But it's in the ground. And since I do come from a long set of American ancestors, it naturally irritates me a bit that people regard this as some exotic adventure on my part, rather than taking it as face value, that it happened to be the particular way I found of symbolizing what to me were the crucial public issues of my generation, and which, in a funny way, like an old GM movie, if life did end, now has a happy ending. I just came back from Madrid last week on the invitation of the Spanish government with 4, we met in Madrid, 4 Spanish artists, 5 Latin American artists, and myself, because the king had commissioned a portfolio of 3 lithographs by each of us, illustrating the 30 articles of the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. And there was sort of a ceremony presenting it to him. And it so happens that I felt a little bit uneasy in a way. Here I am spent my life on the Spanish Republic, and here I am be receiving by a king if I become a royalist in my old age. But there was a unanimous opinion that he is, in our sense of the word, a Democrat, or what we would call a liberal, and is hell-bent on unifying Spain, which has terrible internal strife, because Franco destroyed the Basque language, the Basque universities. You could be sent to jail for speaking Basque. And a large part of Spain is Basque-speaking, and the same with Catalonia. In fact, the one artist, a great one named Tapias, from Catalonia, who contributed to this book, would not come to Madrid because because Catalonian is not was not permitted under Franco. In fact, the wife of one of the Spanish artists, a sculptor named Cholida, I was talking to at a reception at the Mexican embassy for Tamayo, the great Mexican artist, and it turned out that she was Basque. And so I asked her about the present Basque terrorism coming on, and she's a lovely, small, elegant woman who happens to have, I think, 11 children, and belongs to the 40 years where Franco did not allow Basque to be spoken, the university dismantled, etc. And she said, now my little grandchildren laugh at me because I cannot speak Basque. My parents can speak Basque. They and their little school children can speak Basque now. Since the death of Franco, it's been reinstated. And she said, do you know what it is to lose your identity when you lose your language? And it seems to me that other people have other experiences in their way and in their places and so on, and symbolize what concerns them and so on. And that's what I happen to do, without ever realizing that the Spanish under Franco, among other things, felt deserted by the rest of the world. No liberals could leave Spain, and no liberals would go to Spain. And as a consequence, when I had a show there 4 or 5 years ago, I was embraced in a way that was beyond my painting and couldn't understand it at first. And then I suddenly realized that in their eyes, somebody in the outside world hadn't forgot. And of course they romanticized it and exaggerated it, but I must say it was awfully moving too. Now, the last thing I want to say is, which I really don't want to talk about very much, is this eternal question, what were the 40s like? And actually now there's so much written about the abstract expressionists. There are books on de Kooning, on Rothko, on Still, on Klein, on whoever, that in a way one ought to look it up, except, and there's even a quite marvelous book that came out in paperback, unfortunately very poorly printed, by a photographer named Fred McDarrow, called The Artist's World. Came out in 1961. And he photographed 8th Street, 10th Street, the whole cast of characters. It was about 1961, what had started in 40, the rise and dominance of abstract expressionism began to end with the arrival of pop art and all the various things that have happened since. So they caught it, let's say, really at its heights, and they're by accident, I came across it today when I was looking for something else, and I hadn't looked at it in years, and thought how voracious it is as to what our world of the 40s looked like, and the cast of characters is there. The one thing that was probably not exaggerated, not emphasized enough, is the presence of the European emigre artists, the refugees from Europe, and the ominousness of the early 40s with, during the early 40s, the Germans seeming to advance and advance and advance so that the map of Europe got blacker and blacker on the front page of the Times each day till you thought there'd be no end to it. And yet in another way, I think most of the Americans who, most of the artists, all the artists I've spoken of, were older than I am, which is say they were, say in 30 instead of 20 in 1936, had come to maturity in the depths of the Depression. And I think the Depression psychology was as much deep in them as the fact that a world war was going on. I think the American Civil War and the 1930s Depression are the two deepest scars in the whole of American history. I mean, that's one man's opinion. And in those days, most of the artists I knew were or had been on the WPA. It's how they survived the 30s, for something like $27 a week, and politically regimented quite a lot, I gathered. It's very interesting that in abstract expressionism, there's practically no political pictures, and I think because they'd had a belly full of it in the 1930s. And I remember Rothko talking about it once, the $27, and said, look, if I'd been able to get a job, and I'm not very competent to get a job, there's a saying among painters that one of the reasons you're a painter is you're really not competent to do anything else. He said, supposing I'd been lucky enough to get a job in the 30s, it would have been $35 a week, and I was really better off with $27 a week and doing what I really wanted to. And there was a certain kind of freedom in that, a certain kind of, the big world was going past at its own speed and unconcerned with what you were doing, and you could be unconcerned with it. And that kind of psychological freedom that comes from not being oppressed, but by the same token, in a funny way, being liberated, because nobody is basically interested, then there's no reason not to do anything you want to do. And I think the Cubist period in Paris, around 1908 and 10 and 12, when, in Montmartre, where bourgeois Frenchmen didn't care what they were doing up there either, and the pictures had no commodity value, and maybe had a couple dozen or 100 people more or less interested, and there was a kind of camaraderie and a kind of joy in doing your thing. Now, in 1985, as you all know, art has become a very expensive commodity. It's become maybe not only a legitimate career as a career, but a desirable career. And because we have thousands of colleges teaching it, and maybe 1,000 museums, and millions of people who have taken courses in it, who have gone to the museums and so on, that self-selection of when there was nothing in it no longer exists. In fact, it now draws many ambitious people. The other day I was talking to a relatively young painter, talking about another young painter who's become quite celebrated, and the painter I was talking to said, look, he would have made it in anything. He's that type of person. And, you know, when I think of Pollock or David Smith or Rothko or whatever, there are a lot of things that they simply couldn't have made it in, not out of lack of intelligence, on the contrary, maybe because of more intelligence or a different set of values or whatever. But who knows, there was no possibility then of recognition of worldly goods, of all of the prizes that can be dangled nowadays. As Roberto Mata said to me once when I was criticizing around 1941 some show we were at, and there seemed a certain aspect of it that looked weak to me, and he said, it's easy to say it when you're not engaged. Wait till you're showing. And I think one can say that abstract expressionism was a quite idealistic movement, but on the other hand, it's relatively easy to be pure if nobody is tempting you. And now I know of and know some artists who are being tempted all the time. In fact, today in my mail, there was a letter from Philippe de Rothschild, who has a small painting of mine that he used on a label for the 1974 Rothschild, Mouton Rothschild, and wanted to know if I would permit this image to be turned into jewelry. And I wrote a letter back saying thanks, but no thanks. And things like that in 1940 were inconceivable. And I'm not saying either situation is better or worse. What I mean is that history is real. We existed in a different historical situation as young men and made our decisions accordingly. Young artists now, in 1985, live in a very different historical situation, in the most affluent and extravagant society in the history of humanity. And who is to say how any given person transferred in a time warp from one period to the other would behave? Though I must say, though I don't particularly like having just become 70, I am glad that I belong to the 40s in many respects, but it may be that I just can't keep up with the world as it rushes by now. Thank you very much.
Mr. Motherwell, I would just like to thank you on behalf of all parties at the Y for this thoughtful, insightful, and fascinating lecture.
Thank you.
And now we'd like to move on to the questions and answers, and we have quite a number of them. You might want to sit down.
I'll step a minute.
And we'll try and get through as many as we can. First question has two parts. Is it correct to say that an abstract expressionist painter paints without a plan, but is led on by the material? And secondly, is this very different from the way the old masters painted?
Well, I thought I answered all of that earlier.
question.
Next question.
Next question. How does the meaning of spontaneity change as you work through the various stages of the work? For example, in the creation of the reconciliation elegy.
Well, that's difficult. The new wing of the National Gallery is massive and relatively geometrical and huge. I mean, you sort of drown in space, so to speak. And it was also part of the commission that it not be a mural, which would have been one solution, but that it be, even though it was a very big picture, I think it's 32 feet wide or something like that, was nevertheless to be clearly hung on a wall. And they gave me the proportions, which I think are ill proportioned for the thing. But in relation to the, I saw models of the building, quite large models, and also was there while it was being built. And I wanted to make something more human in the sense of being more spontaneous than any piece of architecture could be, and did so in the sketches. Now, it required a certain artfulness that I'm not sure that I wholly succeeded in doing that on a very large scale. I mean, see, the difficulty, when you get beyond what's called easel size, so long as you're within easel size, you're using peripheral vision. As you're working this corner up here, you can still see this corner down here, and your eye automatically begins to put the proper amount or balance it, or all the complex things that are going on. The instant it's as big as this stage, you only see this much in front of you. And I painted in my studio on the floor, and my studio is only 20 feet wide, so that I never saw the picture until it was installed, because they took it rolled to Washington. So I never saw it vertically until it was installed, and also you can see it from about 100 yards away, and it was impossible for me, in the circumstances under which I made it, to gauge accurately what a great distance would do to it, so that if I could redo it, I would allow more for the distance. Would you say from a great distance, it looks too silhouetted when you're relatively close to it, which you have to be if you're near it, because it's on a balcony, which is not too deep. And then the surface is wedded much more to the forms, which of course is how I saw it when I was painting it. If I had such a project again, I think I would try to do it in a theater studio, in a scenic design place where things are arranged that you more adequately can deal with this kind of problem.
How do you explain styles or schools of painting if the creative process is such an intensely personal act?
Well, that's why there are so many schools. But I also think that, to use an arbitrary number, that there may be about 6 kinds of painting minds. I used to be a sort of one-man graduate school at Hunter College in the 50s, which is I gave both the seminars in modern art and ran the studios. And in those days, Hunter was a normal school. It was a teacher's training school. In fact, if they thought somebody applying to these classes wanted to be an artist, they wouldn't admit them, was the idea was that these people go back into the New York City school system, and also they were in the late afternoon and evenings, the classes, because my students have been teaching all day in elementary schools and high schools, and would come in and exhausted, and though they were art teachers, were used to having everybody paint bunnies at Easter and decorate hospitals with Santa Claus at Christmas and so on. Or I remember one day coming in and everybody had charcoal on their faces, and I remarked to somebody, "You've got charcoal on your head," and suddenly I realized it was Ash Wednesday, and it was the first time it ever occurred to me that New York is so Catholic. And then several weeks later, it came out in the Times that then, in the 50s, New York was 50% Catholic, I think 30% Jewish, and 10% WASP, which I imagine were, or I shouldn't say WASP, Protestant, which I imagine were mainly blacks, and 10%, I don't know what, Indians, Chinese, and so on. And it struck me that there was a funny kind of Puritanism, because Irish Catholics, and I can say this as being part Irish, and I think a lot of Italian Catholics in America are relatively puritanical, and you add that to Protestant Puritanism and traditional Jewish Puritanism, and even though New York is in one way is a kind of Istanbul, in another way it's strangely unsensual for a metropolis. But anyway, it so struck me, that thing, that the next collage I made, I crushed a piece of charcoal with my thumb and marked it and called it Ash Wednesday. And it's actually one of the most beautiful ones I've ever made. I forget what the question was.
I think perhaps you answered it. It was about styles and schools of painting.
Oh, okay. I could go into it a lot, but I won't.
All right, we'll go. Why does the weakest become the strongest, and vice versa, when placed next to each other?
Well, each picture grows by itself, so to speak, and say you're working on 10 pictures at once, in a way it's like having 10 children. I mean, real children. And if you have children, you realize almost from birth they're somewhat different and so on, and yet there's a kind of general character that tends to run through the family too. And I suppose what you instinctively do is choose the best aspects of one and praise that, and the better aspects of another and praise that, and so on, and try to bring it to a certain kind of equilibrium. Every once in a while I get an offer to, say, make engravings in Paris or in California, or woodcuts in Japan, or so on. And once I did it, and was in Switzerland, and was really paralyzed because I had nothing of my own around, and I really could not judge what I was doing. And of course, other people looking at these same things might decide another one is the strong one and another one is the weak end. That in the end has to be my judgment, but in the end I bear the responsibility for it. And that's also part of the price of not working with a program or not working with predetermined ends. Obviously, if you have a predetermined end, you know when you reach it. But if you're experiencing it as open-ended, then it's the sense of completion can only come when you sense that in some way the object is as far as one can go, or also maybe one feels that one's original impulse in some way found its completion. It's very easy to get lost in this way of painting, and I think it's why most schools of painting, whether they're minimalism or painting from the nude, are, relatively speaking, programmatic.
Perhaps this question should have followed your demographic breakdown of New York. Do you think that there is a lack of spirituality in today's art?
Well, today's art is so diverse, it would depend on what aspect of what we're talking about. It would also depend on whether by spirituality religious feelings are meant, or humanistic feelings, whatever. I mean, I used to astonish my students at Hunter by describing pictures always in terms that you would describe people as homely or beautiful or awkward or graceful or whatever. And the students at first would find it a very funny way to talk about it. In the end of a year, they'd all be talking exactly the same way. And what I started to say before when I brought up Hunter was the students were so naive that I could give them the classical problems of modern art, say the Fauve problem of painting landscapes with bright colors and rhythm, or as also is true in German Expressionism, which derives a lot from Fauvism, or give them the Cubist problem, or give them a collage problem, or give them a constructivist problem, and they wouldn't realize what I was doing. And what I discovered was that with each problem, at least one, and sometimes several, and maybe once 10, took to that particular kind of problem as a duck to water. And then I would encourage, whenever I felt this about one of the students, to develop more in that direction that seemed native to them. At the same time, what was being left out of the equation was that painting is also a cultural problem that has to do with issues that develop as painting develops in various ways, and I couldn't cultivate them far enough to make those kind of decisions. But I really do think that they're probably genetically or experientially or a combination of both, about half a dozen ways that are quite deep in human beings, of these separate tribes, so to speak, of seeing the world, and that it's a matter of historical chance, in a sense, which kind of painting mind becomes dominant at a certain period. Or, for example, think of how small Amsterdam was in the 17th century, and there are Vermeer, who I think is one kind of painting mind, and Rembrandt side by side in a place where there probably weren't more than 100 painters all told, walking the same streets. In fact, in Switzerland, I met, through my wife, who's European, my wife Renata, Karl Zuckmayer, who was a famous playwright in Germany and partly Jewish, and just managed to escape across the Swiss border during the war period, because he had been in the First World War. He's written a marvelous memoir of it, whose title I can't remember, because he had won the Iron Cross, and somehow the people at the border let him through. And we were having a drink in a cafe, and he became evident to him that I was an artist, and we began to talk about art a little bit. And I remarked that maybe the best film I'd ever seen about an artist was Alexander Korda's Rembrandt, with Charles Laughton playing the part. And to my stupefaction, Zuckmayer said that he had written the script for it. And that the reason, and one of the things that struck me about the Korda production is Korda brilliantly had Rembrandt, as that cornmeal, gruffy, tender, heedless guy, but it was all in Vermeer interiors. And there was something startling because to see Rembrandt walking around inside Vermeers. And Zuckmayer said something that I found extraordinarily illuminating. He said, you know what the problem was? What would Rembrandt sound like? And he said, I thought and thought, and Rembrandt was the son of the generation of the Dutch who had held off the Spanish Empire with the finger in the dike and all the rest of it, and as Protestants against the Catholicism of the Duke of Alba and so on. And he said suddenly, and in reading about the period, he realized that Protestants read from the Bible at morning, noon, and night, and that Rembrandt should talk in the words of the Bible. And then I remembered there was a passage in the film in Rembrandt's old age when he's getting his big beard nose and is broke and is with his comrades and so on, and somebody provokes him, and he begins to talk about woman in a way that's like the Song of Songs. And I thought, seeing that movie years before I ever met Zuckmayer, what an inspired way to convey that humanistic sensuality of Rembrandt.
When you approach a small canvas rather than a large, are your gut feelings different? And the person asks, is it the difference between wearing fitted, tailored clothing rather than loose clothing?
No, it's an instantaneous shift in one's mind sense of scale. And the advantage of a small painting is you can work very rapidly, seeing it all at once. But I said somewhere, I think in one of the notes that I didn't use tonight, that I tend to be most challenged by either a big canvas or a small canvas. The standard easel side, for some reason, is the most difficult for me, for reasons I don't know why.
The question is, working with such large canvases, do you have other artists working with you?
Well, I have an assistant who's actually a rock and roll composer, who turns out to be better than any painter I ever had as an assistant, because he understands a jam session and also has no envy or judgment, in a sense, about what we're painting, just goes to it with gusto. At 70, I can't lift some of the huge canvases, and there's a lot of dirty work of, I still enlarge in the Renaissance way by squaring up just to know where I am and redraw it once it's done, but he does the dirty work and gets the materials and so on. And because my painting is built a lot of improvisation, he also comprehends that. It doesn't seem silly to him, or does he want to censor me or anything else? In fact, I think musicians are maybe the most admirable set of artists I've ever known, because I think they're used to playing with each other, And they have to get rid of a lot of that ego problem that solitary people have. And I also think it's harder to get away with lousy music than with lousy writing or lousy painting.
What words of courage would you give to artists whose imagery is different than that which is hot today?
Oh, and there's only one answer to everything. You have to be true to yourself. And it is not your fault if the historical period for a moment or for a long time prefers something else. But otherwise you get involved in adapting to that which you're not. And the whole point of art is an expression of a specific individual humanity. See, the difference between modern art and all other world's art is it's not tribal. It's an art of individuals. And if you betray your own individuality, then you become part of a herd of individuals.
The person asks, why do you paint oval forms in most of your paintings?
Because I contrast them with straight forms, Woody. And he said, don't you like pictures? And I said, yes. And he said, after the game, I'm going to a place where they have some pictures. Would you like to come along? And I said, no. And he said, oh, come on. And we went, and it was the Steins. And I saw my first Matisses and first modern pictures in my life. And again, they went through me like a shot. And on the spot, I made up my mind that I'd like to belong to that world. And in my naivete, because it was Cézanne and Matisse, I thought it had to do with Frenchness. And when I could, went to Paris and discovered ultimately that it wasn't Frenchness, it was the general aesthetic of modernism. And now my heroes are, I mean, I have not lost them, but also Joyce or Stravinsky or whoever. Pause mean as much to me as they do. I mean, there's a whole culture, and most of the battles in the art world are for modernism or against it, and I happen to think it's closer to the modern sense of reality overall. You know, the unconscious has no politics or sense of nature or knowledge of death or of politics. It thinks it's immortal and just has a kind of drive to be at any cost. And I think secular painting, which is non-tribal painting, which is what modernist painting is, represents that drive more and more nakedly, and perhaps unfortunately, I don't know. All I know is all the work of our time, with very few exceptions, that I respect falls in that general thing. Listen, I'm exhausted.
I was just
And
going to say, thank you very much.
thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.